Good evening and welcome to The Big Picture. Tonight we see how the development of nuclear energy and the threat of nuclear war have profoundly affected our language and culture in Eclipse of the Man-Made Sun.
Countermeasures come in active, attacking the defenses, passive, hiding, hardening, threatening countermeasures, augmenting the force. Penetration aids to confuse the system. Nuclear-armed anti-satellite systems, each of them with 150 rocket-accelerated homing kill vehicles.
The language that you use in that world is the language of the user of the weapon, the language of the planner. All the things that you're concerned about are about how to deploy, how to fire, how to employ these weapons. And somehow then they become a part of your own power. And you're never in the perspective of the victim. You never have the things falling on you. You're the one who's launching them in the first place.
As if from the bowels of the earth, a light not of this world, the light of many suns in one. If the first man could have been present at the moment of creation when God said, "Let there be light," he might have seen something like what we saw.
A great blinding flash brought an early dawn to the Jornada del Muerte. It was brighter than any dawn man had ever seen on earth. The mountain stood out sharply in the light of the man-made sun. There was no sound. I waited a few seconds, and this time I saw a sight beyond my wildest dream. An enormous white sphere rose out of the Holocaust and started skyward. And all this time there was complete, deep silence.
Then came the strong, sustained, awesome roar, which warned of doomsday, and made us feel that we puny things were blasphemous to dare to tamper with the forces heretofore reserved to the Almighty.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Religious symbolism enabled people to make sense of this catastrophic explosion and make sense of it in terms of the dominant and most potent symbolism of the culture. Using religious language makes new human inventions appear as if they are parts of nature or a part of inevitable history foreordained by some divine authority.
It is an awful responsibility which has come to us. We thank God that it has come to us instead of to our enemies. And we pray that he may guide us to use it in his ways and for his purposes.
Christian mythology is so deeply rooted in our culture that it's bound to be used at periods of crisis. There have always been fears of a final apocalypse, and there's always been a hope that an elect band of people would be saved at the final judgment.
Well, nuclear war and the second coming of Jesus Christ, Armageddon and the coming war with Russia. What does all this have to do and to say with and to you and me? It says this: prepare to meet thy God.
It's a continuation, if you like, of the religious imagery that we saw around 1945, in the sense that it places nuclear weapons, their development, their potential use outside the sphere of human responsibility, and strongly implies that they're a part of a supernatural plan in which man has a very small role.
It seemed immense, virtually unspeakable. A complex infrastructure of fear and security. Then she reminded me that we'd both grown up in the so-called Age of Deterrence, in which war had been designed to be carried out mostly in the imagination. The language of the user. The destroyer is the protector. The threat of powerlessness, the dream of power. Never before, it seemed to her, had so much force been deployed simply through what people thought and said about it.
Nuclear weapons pose a very, very big problem to the human psyche in trying to deal with them. Here they are, this tremendously powerful, tremendously frightening, tremendously out of control weapon that cannot really be used as a weapon militarily and yet promises tremendous political power.
You know, we can't just wish this atomic energy thing away. We can't pretend that it never happened.
Of course we can't wish it away. I don't think that we want to. People were afraid of electricity, of airplanes, automobiles. But we learned to make these things work for us.
There's so much talk about building a bigger and better bomb. I don't want any part of the whole atomic business.
I don't think I'd take it exactly like that, George.
Hello, Don.
Hi, Dad. Well, how else is a fellow supposed to take it? Have the fellows down at the lab come up with some sort of equation that proves everything's going to come out all right?
No, son, we haven't. And the only man that ever had was crucified 19 centuries ago.
I'll make some coffee.
I used to feel the same way you do about atomic energy until colors straightened me out. To me, it was just a bomb, and so I hated it.
Well, Mr. Colors, isn't that about what it is?
Mostly what it's been used for so far. That's the tragedy of nuclear energy. It had to begin at Hiroshima. No wonder the world is confused. Many of us are afraid. Mr. Vernon, think about primitive man thousands of years ago before he learned the use of fire. All fire meant to him was forest fire that might burn him to death, fire from volcanoes. He was afraid of it. He hated it. Naturally, he never thought that fire would become man's servant instead of his master.
Memories of the lost rituals, of sacrifice, initiation, invention, the civilizing myths of the West. Stories, legends, and popular ideas to stay with, to find solace in, to think with. Dreams harnessed and perfected through the words, transformed through the magic of technique. The new made familiar, and the political, natural.
There is no denying the shadow of the atom bomb has been across all our lives. But wisdom demands, too, that we take time to understand this force. Because here, in fact, is the answer to a dream as old as man himself, a giant of limitless power at man's command.
Since the ancient Greeks gave it a name, the atom has intrigued alchemists, philosophers, and scientists. Many sensing that within the atom, a powerful force is held captive.
For thousands of years, man has searched for the clue, the key that would allow him to transform one chemical element into another. To change lead or mercury into gold. This was the dream of alchemists in their medieval workshops. Though never successful, they passed that dream along to succeeding generations. Making new chemical elements from old ones remains one of the fundamental challenges for scientists who are working with nuclear energy.
The interesting thing about the alchemical analogy is that built into the ideas of the old alchemists was the idea of a quest for the elixir of life, for something good, life-giving, something which would bring health and transformation. The transformation of something inherently destructive and evil into something good and beneficial. The alchemist figure is like the magician, an elite figure with privileged access to the secrets of the universe, which he unlocks by his magic. If the early nuclear physicists thought of themselves as alchemists, the politicians, perhaps later on, thought of themselves, presented themselves as magicians. And I suppose that magic is a way of mediating between culture and the forces of nature. Magician is a priest-like figure who stands in between society and nature and manipulates those forces of nature.
With a touch of an atomic wand, the president activated a circuit which set in motion an earth-moving machine thousands of miles away. Truly, the superpower which man has released from within the atom's heart is not one, but many giants. One is the warrior, the destroyer. Another is the engineer seeking to provide vast quantities of energy to run the world's machines. And the last is the research worker, working on in the fields of pure science to reveal more of the mysteries of the universe. But all are within man's power, subject to his command. On man's wisdom, on his firmness in the use of that power, depends now the future of his children and his children's children in the new world of the atomic age.
In Australia in the late 40s and early 50s, you can see a gradual reorientation of the discourses about uranium, trying to rescue the idea that it was a very destructive, devastatingly destructive element, and trying to reorganise that argument to posit uranium as being a miraculous thing which could be used for peaceful purposes. You read magazine articles, newspaper articles that go out of their way to point out to a general reading public that the origin of the word uranium is the Greek word Uranus, which means the sky, or more importantly, the heavens. So notions of peace and miraculousness and heavenly origins unite to reproduce uranium as something transcendental, something quasi-religious for people.
Deep in these hills lies a meeting of the oldest and newest forms of civilization. Behind the rugged facade, embedded beyond human gaze, lies the future of one race and the past of another. The hills are in Arnhem Land, and beneath them, uranium.
Uranium was cast as what was called the hot rock, and one had all sorts of popular phraseology about that heat, that notion of a fever. The rock itself was said to emit pulses, it was said to glow, it was said almost to have a form of animacy about it. It became something which was magical in its origins and in its function, and so on.
A crackle of static through the headphones created a mood of suppressed excitement, as though at the discovery of secret forces in the earth. It seemed fitting that a substance that was to revolutionize the modern world should be sought in so ancient and remote a setting. This was something new in mining, something new in human activity. Man, it appeared, was no longer content with molding the visible world to his needs. He was thrusting deeper into the invisible, into the black magic of radioactivity, into the primal atomic structure of the universe. Perhaps groping to the roots of the life force itself.
He said that he believed in the hidden symmetry between obstetrics and metallurgy, Mother Nature and mine shafts deep into the earth. But there was a danger in violating the natural order. He said it could result in uncontrollable contamination. Pandora, Eve. He summarized the myths of pollution and the rituals of cleansing, and spoke of the recent proliferation of new technologies, new ideas, and of cancer, which he called a gross corruption, both political and genetic. She was thoughtful for a while, and then said that the importation of ideas had to do with war, which is economics.
American ideas about nuclear energy started to proliferate in Australia, I think about 1953. It was in that year that the US Atomic Energy Commission sent delegates to Australia, and it was in 1953, likewise, that the US-Australian link vis-a-vis uranium mining was firmly established.
All over the world, there is interest and speculation about this drab-looking piece of North Australian bushland. For here, men are discovering and mining uranium, today the world's most prized metal.
There was a popular distribution of Geiger counters of a sort of amateur nature for people who were amateurs to go out into the countryside and use them to find the hot rock in the desert. Uranium prospecting and fossicking was kind of advertised as being a way in which the family could enter into not only the national search for uranium, but also enter into a fun leisure time activity.
Prospectors armed with Geiger counters instead of picks and pans flocked into the Cloncurry Mount Isa district of northwest Queensland when news of the big strike leaked out. Soon, the first commercial contract for the sale of uranium to the United Kingdom and America was signed, involving a £10 million capital outlay to establish the mining township of Mary Kathleen, an atomic bonanza of the 50s.
They were traveling deeper into the interior. They had few words to speak of this place, perceiving only emptiness and a sense of their own motion. They were never at peace, she thought. They seemed to always be moving towards something that was moving away from them. She turned and looked out the window.
At Kingsford Smith Airport, the highest-ranking American ever to visit Australia arrives with his wife from New Zealand. He is the Vice President of the United States, Senator Richard M. Nixon, and he is on a special goodwill mission as the representative of President Eisenhower.
We have a secret weapon. It isn't the atomic bomb. It's the people. The people want peace. On this trip, I have been talking to people. I'm talking to labor union people tomorrow and to business people, to farmers in this country and in all the countries that I visit. And I have yet to find an ordinary citizen in any country who didn't want peace.
What I think we must realize is that Nixon is being an ambassador for the peaceful uses alibi that had been worked up in 1953 by Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program, which was an alibi for amazing proliferation of nuclear weapons and so on and so forth.
It is not enough to take this weapon out of the hands of the soldiers. It must be put into the hands of those who will know how to strip its military casing and adapt it to the arts of peace.
Atoms for Peace was first announced to the world by President Eisenhower in December 1953 in a speech at the United Nations. In that speech, Eisenhower was announcing a program for the peaceful civil development of atomic energy.
Yes, the atom is on its way to brighten our towns and to help manufacture our most dependable and indispensable household servant, electric power. Electricity that illuminates our lives, frees us from drudgery, and brings us in contact with all the world through radio, telephone, and television can now be produced from the energy within the atom.
I think Eisenhower was concerned to promote a transformation of the destructive military potential into a vision of limitless cheap energy, which would transform civilized life into a new golden age.
Productive use of nuclear power, like the use of all great new things being developed in the United States, depends upon people recognizing a need for it. And as yours and Eve's needs increase, the investor-owned electric companies that gave you Connecticut Yankee will investigate even further the most modern concepts of the day to guarantee you ample electric power so that Eves of every age can live their lives fruitfully in their electrical gardens of Eden.
Nuclear plants are popular because they are also aesthetically attractive. This plant in India looks more like a floral-covered campus by the sea than a utility. In Spain, the plants blend with the terrain and quaint village life. In Germany, they represent progress, even for those who make their living from the earth. In Japan, they are artistically integrated into the Japanese landscape and symbolize Japan's future in a changing world of wonders.
Well, George, does that answer your question?
Sure does. Giving me a whole new perspective. That's a story everybody ought to hear. Why, the peacetime uses of atomic energy are going to turn out to be more important to us than the bomb. And take, for instance, the things we've been talking about today. The machine for cancer therapy, power plants to light our homes and do our work, atomic energy to supplement our traditional fuels.
Now you're getting the idea. Of course, we who work in atomic energy have seen these possibilities all along. The weapons we've developed have been a means to an end. Our first responsibility was national security. That's a continuing job and one we can never let up on. But out of the work that's been done and the things we've learned, will come benefits to mankind that we can as yet only imagine. There's a new dawn breaking over our world, the hopeful dawn of the atomic era. What benefits it will bring, what blessings it will bestow, we can only guess. This much is sure. The same forces, the same laws, the same hopes that brought us to this threshold are still at work. With faith in ourselves and the destiny that guides us, we can move forward to new and even greater achievements in the atomic era. This is the hope that awaits us in this new dawn's early light.
He would travel to the Antipodes, space, youth, gold, sea. The possibilities of a new society, clean, efficient, without industrial or political strife. Paradise, where heaven is earth, where the future unites with the present, and body and soul converge, where nothing is closed off or concluded, nothing disappointing, mundane, or mortal. The only constant is the dream, the horizon.
Here in the semi-desert region of South Australia, 300 miles north of Adelaide, where once there was nothing but gibber and sand and a few hardy desert trees and plants, there has sprung up a modern oasis, Woomera.
As the peaceful uses of uranium argument started to be proliferated, so did the reinvigorating of those old utopian ideas about making the desert bloom. So, in a way, uranium was the vehicle by which a lot of urban problems in Australia during the 1950s were transposed, if you like, or displaced into the desert.
Householders have established colourful gardens and are proud of the products they've raised in soil so recently won from the desert.
And the desert became a kind of utopian place or a utopian space where ancient things and modern things would reunite, and where the scientific experiments that would bring us into the modern age could be carried out.
When Captain Cook sailed from England in 1768, he was given two objectives: to observe the course of Venus from the island of Tahiti, and then to discover whether the unexplored part of the southern hemisphere be only an immense mass of water or another continent. When he dropped anchor at Botany Bay and put a boat ashore, almost at once a group of Aborigines appeared and tried to drive him off. They stood on the rocks yelling loudly and threatening the boat's crew with a strange contraption called a woomera.
Europeans have always seen Australia, the continent, and Australia, the people, as being caught in a laboratory situation ever since the end of the 18th century, where Australia was used as a botanical laboratory, and later when it was used as a social laboratory. It's always been kind of the wastepaper basket for experiments that Europeans found that they didn't want to particularly carry on in their homeland.
I think it would be interesting if you would tell us what you can, within the bounds of security, on what's going to happen at your fascinating Woomera Range next month, and what the Australian participation in the atomic experiments with Britain is.
Well, the Woomera rocket range is more or less in the center of Australia, in a desert area. It's an enormously long range, about 1,500 miles, and you can shoot guided weapons or atomic bombs or anything you like out there without disturbing anybody.
In the remote half-desert wastes of Central Australia this morning, I saw the first atomic weapon ever exploded on the mainland of Australia. With split-second timing and military precision, the test was made with complete success, marking another great step forward in British Australian defence organisation.
We have now commenced the last and final phase of Wombat.
Soon a calm voice speaking through loudspeakers on the grandstand ridge began reporting on how the final phases of the operation were progressing. These phases had been named after Australian animals and birds.
Then the last few moments came. The countdown began.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, +1. You may turn now.
And at 0, the eastern skyline melted into a cauldron of flame. The huge ball of flame seemed to pulsate with a deadly life. The whole thing seemed evil, but full of immense strength and power. And the echoes of the blast rumbled away into the skies in waves that seemed likely to pass right across Australia.
The tests, of course, were actually English tests performed in Australia, but there seems to have been a conscious attempt to indigenize the whole mythology of the tests for an Australian public. To them were given names such as Wombat, to some of the phases of them were given names like Platypus, to a major series of tests was given the name Totem, and people came to know and become familiar with names such as Woomera and Emu Field. So that the indigenisation of the whole thing made it familiar, made it intimate, gave people a sense of their own relationship to these momentous events.
Making what was alien familiar, bringing it under a name, under control, embracing it and nurturing it as his own. At the time, he described that strange contraption called a woomera as probably the earliest and most primitive conception of a guided missile. His was a society breathless in wonder and despair, suspended under the constant resimulation of threat and its imprinting into each intimate moment. His eyes still shone when he talked of the Jindavik, the fire flash, Taranaki, and to the vast empty spaces of the interior, which were ideal, he said, for the new era of discovery in the sky.
One of the most extraordinary new conceptualisations of Australia from the point of view of the British tests was perhaps the way that the full range from Woomera out to Montebello was chosen to replicate the distance between Moscow in the USSR and London in the UK. And it's as if there was an imprinting of that European strategic geography off onto the southern part of the world, onto the Antipodes. And indeed, with the British tests in Australia in the 1950s, you can clearly see that they were thought to be simulations of what might happen with regard to nuclear explosions happening in Europe. I think it's important to look at the Cold War not simply as a crisis in international relations, but as a setup that leached deeply into the ordinary lives of ordinary people. It was a redefinition of life on the domestic scale and a re-evaluation of what urban life was all about, what everyday life was all about.
Sydney opens its Isotopes for Industry exhibition. Terribly technical stuff, really, but we can understand it. Well, this much anyway. This gadget is a master-slave manipulator owned by the New South Wales University of Technology and designed to handle radioactive, toxic, and explosive materials. It will pick up things too dangerous for humans to handle. Of course, if you haven't any atom bombs for it to play with, it will do domestic chores too. You know the way the heads are always flying off matches when you strike them? Well, let Maxie, the manipulator, get his fingers burned. Well, strike me lucky. He's actually done it. Maxie cost a fortune and is an expensive cigarette lighter, but boy, how would he be on housework?
The language of the free world, clean, sanitized. New products, icons of this new way of life, purchased, brought into the home and accumulated there. A myth of plenty, the touchstone of capital, a system woven by the market and an urgent fear of lack. Speed, reduction, oil, electricity, vulnerable. The myth was the covenant between the free nations of the West, and its raw material was uranium.
To service each of the uranium mines in Queensland and the Northern Territory, and to a certain extent in South Australia, model towns were set in place and documentary films were made about them, exhibiting them as being the places where the newest in home technology would be realised.
Mary Kay, to give the town its popular name, is the most modern little town I've seen anywhere in Australia. This is the kind of town you might expect to find, but never do. On the outskirts of some prosperous city, protected by trees and lawns from the uproar and ugliness of an aggressive industrial life.
Let's go home with a young worker, Bob Strange. And the home he goes to is a cool bungalow with a shady garden. Families like Bob's have houses designed to make living at Rum Jungle as comfortable as living in a pleasant city suburb. His vegetable garden helps Rosemary with the housekeeping. She has a fully equipped kitchen planned to give as much light and air as possible and as efficient as a city housewife's.
It was the realisation of the 50s urban all-mod cons dream, but paradoxically carried out in the outback.
To the community centre. This attractive town and the lives of all the people in it depend on one thing: the production of uranium. For producing power in this country, generated by atomic energy. Power that might one day light your home and cook your dinner.
So there was a parallel made between new nuclear technology and new domestic technology, with this family in the model town as being the kind of laboratory for working out new forms of social organisation.
Do you have a communist problem in Australia, Mr. Casey?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, we have indeed. We believe we're getting on top of it. Now, we've been working very hard on it for the last 5 or 6 years. And I think it's less of a domestic menace in Australia now than it was a great deal. Oh, we're very conscious of it.
There are those few who loudly maintain that there is no actual threat to the free world at all. Certainly none that can justify either nuclear testing or nuclear armament. The opposite viewpoint holds that the development of our nuclear power has been an absolutely necessary protection against communist hostility and nuclear threats. In this view, the fallout casualties, if any, will be seen as those of unidentified soldiers in the service of humanity. Unknown soldiers in a war which has not struck.
Civil defence procedures and propaganda assured the population that a threat was always there, but of course it never arose. Really, the only thing that reminded people of the threat were those sorts of institutions such as the model towns, the mines themselves, the propaganda that surrounded those things. And what increasingly happened is that that threat imploded into everyday life. It became a form of popular defence of not perhaps land and nation, but rather defence of one's household.
About the door, which is not as solid as we'd like.
What one can have, what one can gain, what one can possess. Those sorts of gadgets and appliances that one wished to enhance or manifest the new 1950s way of living family life is also what can be taken away from you, and it's also the thing that you have to actually defend. One can see how that concretised notions of the family around consumerism, so that the threat itself became the threat to what you can protect within your family environment.
Inside the shelter, it's always Christmas, with Santa ready to calm the fears of the children.
Down here, there's not only the Christmas decorations, you'll notice there's presents here. They're not allowed to touch these. They like to come down and look at them, but they know that they are not allowed to open them unless we had a real fallout situation or bomb explosion. And then, of course, I've tried to create a situation where they're actually looking forward, and it has to be lifelike, it has to be realistic. They must really want to come down here.
So civil defence took in a far larger area of domestic life and of urban life than had ever been experienced during actual wartime situations. Inevitably, that becomes a form of social control which is self-regulating because of the concepts that are installed within the family.
PAL, PAL, acronym for Permissive Action Links, the electronic system designed to prevent the unauthorized firing of nuclear warheads. The means by which the nuclear explosives will be dropped on their targets. The indicator panel in a submarine, which flashes green and red lights to show whether hatches, valves, etc. are locked tight when the vessel submerges.
Little boy, fat man, Trinity, peacekeeper, Zeus, Titan, Atlas, Thor, Poseidon, Polaris, Pershing, Cruise, Sentinel, Safeguard, Vanguard, Lance, Tomahawk, Harpoon, Mace, Star Wars, Hurricane, Totem.
The United States President's annual nuclear weapons stockpile memorandum. It outlines plans for the production of new nuclear weapons.
She told me she'd been on a tour of a nuclear submarine at the New London Navy base. They'd scrambled down a narrow ladder into the sleek, dark tube of the submarine lying in the water, gone through the narrow hallways, past the racks where the men sleep, past all these signs that said, danger, radioactive materials. It was getting more and more dismal the further they went. And finally, when they got to the place where the missiles were, she said the officer who was taking them on this tour turned around with a little grin on his face and said, "Here, would you like to stick your hand through and pat the missile?"
And I kept on hearing that term used. Somebody once later said to me, "Say, I hear you got to pat a B-1 bomber." So I was wondering, what is all this padding that's going on in this world? Because when you think about it, padding is first of all a kind of expression of intimacy, of affection often, or of maybe affectionate domination. It's a sexual thing and an expression, I think, of something of the thrill of the homoerotic power that has to do with that kind of proximity to nuclear weapons and essentially appropriating that power as your own. But at the same time, when you think about padding, it's what one does to babies, to pets. It's something that you do to things that are cute and cuddly, things that are harmless, really. So I think that when you pat a missile or a bomber, you pat it and it becomes cute and cuddly. Its lethality disappears.
Acronym for Ballistic Missile Boost Intercept. The briefcase whose contents allow the United States President to launch a nuclear attack.
Gentlemen, from this room, we control the entire long-range air offense force of 3,000 bombers, tankers, and support aircraft. It is a joint chiefs of staff force which is poised, ready to strike targets anywhere in the world. It is the most powerful military force in world history. If we are to be successful in this mission, we have to have plans of all kinds, detailed blueprints, so to speak, that have been worked out far in advance. These are flexible plans and can be changed to meet any contingency. Let's have a look at some of the displays. Andy, take over here, will you please? We call this the big board. See these clocks here? Never before in military history has time been so important. Sergeant, let's see Plan War Dance. Yes, sir. War Dance is a typical war plan for our heavy units. The fate of the nation may well be determined on such a board as this.
Now, for the present threat, primarily the SS-18s, we have to have the knowledge of when the boosters are launched, precise knowledge of their tracks. So we have to have pre-deployed early warning satellites that give us a knowledge of where the boosters are, and then during the reentry phase to be able to discriminate between the heavy and the lightweight decoys. Since the Soviet Union could harden its boosters, there are questions about lethality. Can we in fact defeat a hardened booster? The survival of our pre-deployed space-based assets, and finally the software that links the entire system together.
The language they use to describe weapons and fighting is actually fairly descriptive in the sense of evoking images of life and death, of bodies, but all of those images are transferred to the weapons rather than to people. So for instance, you talk about a decapitating strike. That doesn't mean that you're decapitating a human body, it means that you're decapitating a command and control system. Or you talk about one weapon killing another, but of course, you can't kill something that's not living to start with. At the same time as that, human death is referred to not as death or killing or fratricide, but as collateral damage.
If you look at that missile over there, it looks rather simple. But when you stop to think that this missile will fly from its launch platform approximately 1,200 miles in some variants and do it on its own and come to the target within a few feet, you get some idea of the complexity of the system. It memorizes it all. It tells itself many times through the flight how well it is doing. and it congratulates itself when it strikes the target.
So what you have is an inversion where words that normally describe human beings, human bodies, and human flesh are all transferred onto weapon systems. And when you talk about human beings, you use completely abstract language. This language comes from a particular place. It comes from the ways of thinking, the ways of looking at the world that have been developed in association with technology. So you find that people are using formal mathematical modeling, linear programming, game theory, systems analysis as ways of thinking about nuclear weapons. Now, those forms of modeling may be appropriate for other kinds of technological artifacts, but they're really wildly inappropriate for thinking about nuclear war.
He described for her a hypothetical first strike scenario in which the United States and the Soviet Union had gone to single warheaded missiles. If the US launched a first strike against the Soviets, it would have to target 2 of its missiles for every 1 of theirs. He said that in this situation, despite the fact that no missiles had even hit the US, while it had just devastated the USSR, the Americans would end up worse off than the Soviets.
What he was talking about was that we would be worse off because we had fewer missiles left at the end of this little event. And that was when I understood the center of this way of thinking is weapons themselves and their relation to each other. That's why you can't talk about human beings. That's why you can't talk about peace. What you can talk about is strategic stability, which of course doesn't refer to all of the social and political and economic conditions involved in peace. What it refers to is a set of relationships between one set of weapons and another set of weapons, or really rather a set of hypothetical relationships between one abstraction of a set of weapons and another.
The language of the user, a reflexive system, perfect, seeking objects, icons, simulating control. Its truncations of context, its speed and dazzling light, energy. Its language filtering back through the cities, flat, spectacular, lifeless, fast.
The clue, the key.
The dream as whole as man himself.
EROS, Environment and Radar Operations Simulator, simulates the radar's external world by producing a controllable, synthetic radar signal that can simulate
communist hostility and nuclear threat.
We thank God that it has come to us.
The threat, the dream,
Nuclear magic.
the model township.
The threat,
Home, neat and clean.
We learn to make these things work for us.
the threat,
It is part of nature. We can't control it.
The longer we wait, the more expensive it gets to colonize Mars.
The clue, the key to God-given creativity.
How will it influence the pattern of our cities?
Much of the technology that will shape our lives in the next century is with us now. Some well established, some experimental, some conceptual. Could we build a city of the future, a technopolis right now, an international city based on how we will live and work in the future? It's an exciting, challenging idea with immense benefit to its residents and to the whole world. A futuristic city that truly integrates lifestyle and work patterns. A city that would link all aspects of being human.
So we're given a series of stories, legends, myths, popularised ideas to stay with, to find solace in, to think with. At the same time, the mythologisation of the system prevents us from actually seeing what the system is, so that what we see and what we elaborate our myths and our ideas around is, in fact, a chimera, a mirage.
I said that era was past now, only its scars remain. She disagreed. The structure was undergoing a transformation, she said. The language too. But little had actually changed. I controlled my anger. There was a new awareness now, a concern with the immaterial, the human again. We would learn to make these things work for us, and there would come benefits that we could as yet only imagine. There was a new dawn breaking over the world. She said nothing. There was a complete, deep silence.
But I think perhaps most people are forgetting something. The nature of the universe isn't our doing. We men over at the lab are, well, we're sort of like Galileo or Newton or Plato for that matter. Like them, we're just searchers after knowledge.
Next Thursday, we explore the life and work of the celebrated German-Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin, who committed suicide in 1940 on the Franco-Spanish border, escaping the Gestapo. Don't miss One Way Street, a compelling edition of The Big Picture, next Thursday night at 9:30. Stay with us now for ABC News, Late Edition and Late Line.
We've ever received. I'm not asking you to take his word for it, as you obviously have no intention of doing. None whatsoever. Neither did I at first. The colors convinced me by showing me a little film they made in Washington.
With all these atomic plants going up everywhere, I wonder if a girl's even safe in her own home. I just hope they know what they're doing. Who's lead?